Hi everybody, I've been wanting to make a video about the Zenit Meteor 5:1 zoom lens for quite some time, particularly how it pertains to actual performance in conjunction with the Zenit K3 or Krasnogorsk-3. I'm mostly going to be looking at modulation transfer function or overall resolution and compare the performance against some other M42 lenses as well. This is going to get fairly pedantic. This is not a super scientific exploration, but I am going to try to do the best I can with what I have. Mileage may vary, of course. I've been told that my 1985 specimen is a particularly good one by several people. I've used it in special effects shots for a music video of mine as well as a commercial. I'm going to be focusing on the ISO 12233 resolution chart. This was designed to test digital photography primarily. I put it on a music stand in my living room and I trained my K3 onto the chart, focused it as best as I could. I lined up my Panasonic GH3 alongside the K3, took the lens off of the K3 and moved it over to the GH3, attaching it via a modified M42 to Micro Four Thirds adapter. I used my 50-inch plasma screen TV to help with focusing further, and this also served as a reference point for testing other lenses in conjunction with the Meteor. All files were captured in RAW format and converted to PNG via RAW therapy using the Amaze algorithm. The uncolor corrected output looks like this, which I then cropped to the standard 16mm aperture. I resized it to 1080 using bicubic resizing, which allows for maximum sharpness without ringing. Before I continue, I need to explain modulation transfer function, or MTF. Resolution is not a definite thing, so we have to set some rules. And the way we do that is measuring the amount of contrast depending on the fineness of the detail being put into it. Resolution is generally considered where the modulation transfer function, or contrast, diminishes by 50%. If we look at this example of Eastman Kodak Vision 3 200T, we can see that the MTF has dropped by 50% at around 60 cycles per millimeter. If we compare that to my all-time favorite film stock Kodak Vision 2 100T, we can see that it essentially has a resolution of almost 70 cycles per millimeter. From this point forward, I will be referring to resolution in lines per millimeter, which is double that of cycles per millimeter, meaning each line is white or black instead of going white to black back to white again. Looking at the 135 and 200 millimeter Super Takamar lenses, of which I have the super multi-coated versions. They're essentially the same glass, that the coatings are just a little bit better in the version that I have, which helps with glare. We can see that the usable resolution is essentially 55 to 60 lines per millimeter. Now, looking at a modern Zeiss prime lens designed for a 35mm coverage area, we have effective resolution of 40 to 50 lines per millimeter, just like the Takamars, except you notice that around 35 lines per millimeter, we actually have an increase of contrast before it drops very rapidly. It actually drops off quicker than the Takamar lens, and the reason for this is because of the coatings that they use on the glass. With a 35mm frame area, you have resolution to throw away. And so by designing the coatings to exaggerate contrast a little bit before dropping, it appears to be sharper to the eye. Figuring out the usable resolution of your entire system requires multiplying the MTFs of all factors together. So in this chart, we have an approximated MTF of Kodak Vision 2 100T, which shows about 130 lines per millimeter. Next, we add in the MTF of a fairly typical industrial lens designed for a 16mm size film frame. When we multiply the two together, we have an output of essentially 90 lines per millimeter. Now, bear in mind, if you're having film scanned, the scanner not only has an image sensor with a finite resolution, but there's also lenses involved, so that will further diminish your resolution. So just because you have a 4K scan done of an image doesn't mean you're going to actually get 4K out of it. Nevertheless, if you take your 90 lines per millimeter times 7.5 millimeters for your overall 16mm frame height, that gives 675 lines of resolution. That is a stark difference from the 1,000 lines the film itself is capable of achieving. Getting back to the Meteor lens, we have our cropped images, which I've taken at different focal lengths and different iris settings in order to show the relative performance between the center of the frame versus the edges. I'm talking about overall lines of resolution for the entire image, not lines per millimeter going forward. I should note before proceeding that at 17 millimeter focal length, I had to unscrew the lens slightly to get it to focus shallow enough. With the rest of the tests, 25 millimeter and longer, I was able to move the camera back far enough to where it could fill the proper frame area without having to unscrew the lens. So just bear in mind that that could weight the performance a little bit. With the lens set to a 17 millimeter focal length, we have about 800 lines of resolution. Yes, you can recover detail finer than that, but for all intents and purposes, our MTF has dropped by about 50% at 800 lines, so that's our resolution. I'm actually really surprised at how well this performs. However, if we look at the edge of the frame, our resolution is quite a bit lower. We're talking around 400 lines, and there's quite a bit of distortion in the lens. Not to mention chromatic aberrations, but we're primarily concentrating on MTF at this point. Now at f4, we have 1,000 lines of resolution at the center of our lens, and at the edge of our lens, we're looking at around 600. Moving on to f8, we have 1,200 lines of resolution at the center of the lens, and at the edge, we're approaching 800, so that's very good. Now at f16, our resolution is starting to drop again because of diffraction off of the iris. But at the edge of the lens, it's quite a bit sharper than it was at f2. Moving on to 25 millimeter focal length, we have quite a bit less lens distortion here. Now at 25 millimeters f2, we have a good solid 850 to 900 lines. And at the edge, I'm going to say probably about 500. At f4, the center of the lens, we're looking at about 1,100 lines, or maybe even 1,200. And at the edge, probably 600 or so. At f8, a good solid 1,200 lines in the center. And at the edge, I'm going to say about 800 lines. At f16, our resolution is dropping quite a bit, so around maybe 800 if you're lucky. And at the edge, 700-ish. 35 millimeter focal length shows still fairly low lens distortion, so good. At 35 millimeter, we're starting to lose performance. At f2, I'm going to say 700 lines. And at the edge, geez, probably 400. At f4, we're probably 800-ish at the center. And let's see, about 400 at the edge. At f8, looks like we're talking around 1,000 lines at the center of the lens. And at the edge, 550, 600-ish. Yeah, at f16, we're talking around 600 lines at the center. And at the edge, about 500. At 55 millimeter focal length, our lens distortion is starting to go the other way, so the edges of the frame are becoming concave. It looks like our resolution is a little bit better at 800, but we're also getting more chromatic aberrations. And at the edge of the lens, 300 maybe. At f4, we have 900 or so at the center. At the edge, I'm going to call that 450. Moving on to f8, have a nice 1,000 lines, very clean, maybe 550, 600 at the edges. And at f16, we're down to maybe 700, 800 in the center, and still about 600 at the edges. At the full 69 millimeter zoom range, we have a little bit more concave lens distortion, but still overall holding its shape fairly nicely. And we have quite a bit lower resolution at f2. I'm going to say around 600 lines at the center, and maybe 250 at the edge. I'm going to say around 800 to 900 lines at f4 at the center. And at the edge, gross 300. Very, okay, so moving on to f8, I'm going to say around 1,000 lines at the center. And, 350 at the edge. And at f16, we're down around 800 again at the center. Around 600 at the edge. Now, the reason we lose resolution as we zoom in more is because we're taking a smaller image and enlarging it, so limitations of the quality of the glass really start to show themselves. And bear in mind also that I don't have the proper equipment to give proper resolution tests. So moving forward, let's take a look at some other lenses. This is the only new M42 lens I own. It is a Zenit 16mm prime lens. A little bit of a convex distortion. 600 lines of total resolution at the center at f4. At the edge, we're talking maybe 400 lines. At f8, we're going to say that's around 700 lines at the center. and 700 at the edge, so much better than the Zenit Meteor. At f8, still around 700-800, and at the edge around 600-700. Looking at a Tamron SMC 28mm lens, which I've used to shoot some music videos. Very little lens distortion. I'm going to say around 800-900 lines at the center of the lens at f4, and maybe 550 at the edge. Moving to f8, around 800 lines, and at the edge, 600 lines. At f16, we're looking at maybe 550 lines at the center, and at the edge, around 550 still. Here's our 135mm Takamar SMC. Very little lens distortion, very low resolution, lots of chromatic aberration. At f4, we're looking at maybe 300 lines if you're lucky. At the edge, again, 300 lines. It's really sad. F8 we're around 600 lines. It's really sad that I bought this lens specifically to use on my K3, and I cannot recommend it. F16 is pretty bad. 500-ish lines at the center and 500 toward the edges. And here we have the Takamar SMC 200mm, which I also bought specifically for my K3. And this one's pretty bad. By the way, these specifications that I'm reading off the monitor here are pretty close to what they published. So yeah, I cannot recommend these longer lenses. That one's tolerable at f8. F16 is pretty useless. Yeah, can't recommend these longer Takamars. For kicks and giggles, let's look at the Lumix 25mm f1.7 lens. I got this $150 brand new. You can see that this is significantly better than any of the lenses that were designed for 35mm cameras. And the reason for that is just because it is designed to cover a small area, therefore the tolerances are much less critical. At f2, we're at 800 lines at the edge of the frame. Looks like around 1,000 lines at f4, maybe 800 at the edge at f4, 1,200 lines at the center at f8, and I'd say around 1,000 at the edge. And at f16, our image starts to fall apart pretty quickly, just because of diffraction through the iris, but that's to be expected. Let's take one final look at the Meteor at 25mm and compare that directly to the Lumix 25mm. Their image is actually pretty close. I think 25mm is about the sweet spot of the Meteor 5:1 lens, especially around f8. I didn't test it at f5.6 just because I had a lot of lenses to test and I didn't have a lot of time, but I can expect f5.6 to be probably the sweet spot of the lens, particularly at 25mm. If we go back and take a look at the Meteor 5:1, all of the elements are uncoated, and I believe that's why we get this distinct ghosting, especially toward the edges of the frame. So we have reflections between the elements, and we have light scattering going through the elements, so that's how we get additional glare. Also, I do believe the elements are all spherical, so it's never quite optimal regardless of your zoom range. Actually, during the process of testing this lens, I had wondered about the plausibility and cost effectiveness of taking apart a Meteor lens, having the elements coated, and then putting it back together. I think the image quality would be greatly increased, but actually its performance toward the center of the frame kind of impressed me. I was not expecting it to perform as well as it did. Bottom line, do I recommend using the Meteor 5:1 zoom lens for 16mm shoots? Yes, absolutely, if you have good control over the lighting conditions, because if you have a lot of specular reflections or practical light sources hitting the lens directly, that's going to increase glare and decrease your image quality. I'm only shooting a test target, so this doesn't account for real-world environments. The other thing is maintain the sweet spot. If you can stay in the 25 to 35 millimeter zoom range, that's where the distortion seems to be minimal. Chromatic aberrations, the resolution seems to be highest, especially at f8. And I didn't test it at f5.6 just to save time, but I suspect between f5.6 to f8 is going to be the sweet spot for the iris. As for using standard full-frame 35mm SLR lenses on the K3, I can't recommend that unless it's a very, very special lens. 50 lines per millimeter is very common resolution for lenses designed to cover the full 35mm still frame area. The larger the image area you need to cover, the wider the glass needs to be, the more precise the manufacturing tolerances need to be. It is extremely difficult to manufacture a lens with a wide coverage area that can still be high resolution. This is why cinema lenses, even prime lenses, tend to be $25,000, $40,000. I have lenses that are designed for 16mm and smaller coverage areas that easily get over 100 lines per millimeter. And ideally, if you want to get full high definition resolution out of your 16mm film scans, you want a lens that gets over 200 lines per millimeter because the limiting factor will be the film at that point. So yeah, I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments section. So thank you.